which means it's the highest in terms of production. For other cereals such as sorghum, millet combined, you have 29% of production. Wheat is around 15%, rice around 11%. In terms of consumption, the most consumed cereal is wheat. If you look into the future, you also see a trend in production. So production of maize is an increasing trend, but when you look at consumption, the most consumed still remains the wheat. So this begs for a question about food security. The most consumed, the most produced crop in Africa is not the most consumed. It's not the most consumed. So people mostly rely on importation of wheat to Africa. So this question, food security and nutrition security. Why? Because these days you want to source your raw materials locally to ensure socio-economic security and also food security. So to me, maize is a miracle crop with a lot of nutritional advantage or benefits, with a lot of minerals, vitamins, proteins, and good source of energy. But the truth is the nutritional composition of this crop is not only defined by the genetic diversity or genetic factor. There are also activities along the chain that affect this nutritional composition. For instance, the crop management or agronomic can also affect. Also, you have post-harvest activities. So all this put together influence the nutritional composition of maize. If you look at consumption also, maize contributes hugely to the daily diet of Africans. Some countries like Congo, Chad, or Niger might, as you can see in the bar, have low intake of from maize, but this country mostly rely on sorghum and millet. But some countries like Kenya, Lesotho, Zambia, and Co. have huge contributions from their diet from maize. For instance, protein can be as high as more than 30% of their daily consumption from maize. Also, some in Kenya, Zambia, and some other countries, mineral contribution can be even more than 50% coming from maize. In Africa, more than 80% of maize is used as food. But regions that are with heavy consumption of maize have some nutritional deficiencies. And some of these can be traced to the natural deficiency in the crop itself. So mostly people consume the normal maize, which has low amount of lysine and tryptophan, and also limitation of food matrix. In Africa, we don't use nixtamalization, so the niacin is still in a bound form. Also, there's presence of anti-nutrient. Phytate in maize can influence iron absorption. Also, there's limited diversity of food. For instance, in Mexico, there are so many types of food produced from maize. But in Africa, we have a limited number of food. And also physical loss. Physical loss is a big challenge. Sometimes maize-based food is just more like a sediment of starch in food. So you consume a lot of starch from it, and you lose some of the nutritional advantage. So this is a major challenge. And also processing and preferences. So if you look at processing and preferences also, there are some crops that have been defined. They have been developed to solve certain nutritional problems. But these crops are not taken up as you would expect. So preferences is also a major challenge in terms of nutrition in Africa. So when you look at these combined, the physical loss during processing and also the preferences you experience, what you think about is the nutritional impact is not just a factor of the genetic makeup of the crop. It's also a factor of activities along the chain. So it's important to look at it to make a bigger impact. It's important to have a system thinking. A system thinking is more like you have different elements of a system. You have someone, the breeders, looking at it from productivity perspective. You have the food scientists or the food technology looking at it from the aspect of how can it be used to make food. Also, you have the consumer looking at it and say, hey, this crop can be good for product. It can give high yield, but can it make good food for me, or can it be used for local or traditional food? So it's different. It's important to combine this element of thinking in one system thinking along the chain, and also you can give feedback to the crop production system. These will ensure proper utilization of the crop and also to improve the dietary needs. And these days, it's not just about farm to table or crop to table, it's about crop to health. So you look at food, not just getting to the table, but you look at it from when it's consumed, how is the iron going to be absorbed? Is it going to be affected by phytate? If you look at the provitamin A, is the retinol conversion activity going to be sufficient? What is the food matrix that can deliver this kind of nutrient? So it's important to look at this post-harvest approach. Then you can give feedback to what is happening in crop production system. Now, I read this book a few months ago. Has any of you read this book? Yeah. I find it very interesting. So you have two very popular scientists. One believe, oh, I can save the world through improving of yield. And of course it did. Norman Borlaug, who is, according to many of us, the soul of seed, he fed billions of people. So he's a techno-optimist. Then you have another person, William Vogt, who believe, the other person is thinking in a way that is not going to save the world. We need to reduce consumption. We need to protect the environment. Of course, these are not mutually exclusive. It's important to synthesize the view of different people to be able to feed the world, to feed the current 900 million people still hungry, and the future 2 billion people still to come. It's important to synthesize opinions and ideas. So I'm going to take you through my publications. So this is my first publication, and this was published in Global Food Security. So the first aspect I'm going to show you is to, just like I've mentioned before, the activities, the agronomic activities is not independent of the last person in the chain. So for instance, you can have a fantastic crop, but if this fantastic crop is viewed by a street vendor as not useful for the street food, then the crop is not successful. So it's important to consider every element of the value chain. But it's also important to mention that consumer preference in Africa is not the same everywhere. So you have Kenya. In Kenya, their consumption of food might be different from what is done in Nigeria. But it's different to look at this element, these differences within Africa, and see how to target people in a better way. Also, we came up with these different elements in the value chain. What are the interconnectivity to lead to food security? And then we look at the different suggestions on areas that breeders can look into. So we came up with 6 suggestions. The first one is, of course, to enhance nutrient density. If you look at my previous slides, consumption in some countries can be as high as 400 grams per day. But if you have high nutrient density crop, you don't need to consume that high to have your daily dietary needs. So if you have quality protein, provitamin A, high concentration of this nutrient inside, you consume little with assortment combined with vegetables, legumes, and others, and then you can meet your daily needs. So it's important to continue in this area of improvement of the nutrient density. Also, when it comes to bread, it's very important, like I mentioned, if we are able to enhance maize to be able to produce a reasonable bread, then it could make a lot of impact, because currently we rely on wheat, and as you we agree or no, agroecological condition of Africa is not very suitable for wheat, Sub-Saharan Africa, I mean. So if we can find variety of maize that can be suitable for baking, it will be very important. Also, one type of snacks that is trending in Africa due to urbanization is also popcorn. But popcorn production mostly rely on importation. So how can, if we can have breeds of popcorn that can really adapt to Sub-Saharan Africa, this will be very important. Also, popcorn probably can also have an improved nutrition in terms of maybe it can, the protein or a mineral in popcorn can also be improved to target the people. Also, you have green maize. Green maize is consumed in very high quantity actually in Africa. So after harvest, everywhere in Africa you see green maize. But after a few months, it's gone. So how can we extend our consumption of green maize all through the heat, all through the year? And also I find green maize very interesting. Why? Because if you look at other foods in Africa, it requires a lot of extensive processing, which you can lose many nutrients. But in terms of green maize, you consume it as a whole. So nutrient loss is not as bad as what you have in other processing. So it's a very good way to target the people. Also, in terms of processing, it's important to have varieties that can facilitate processing and also reduce waste and also reduce anti-nutrients. So in this publication, we mentioned that to ensure agronomic excellence, it is very, very important to align agronomic, it is important to align agronomic excellence to consumer preference. So if there's no alignment, you can have a short-term success, but this success can be sustained for a very long time. So it's important to align these two. Also, it's important to define the quality parameters of these varieties. Also, when it comes to all actors in the value chain, it is very, very important to align their interests to have a successful breeding activities. And from what I've seen so far in the past 1 month in the lab, breeding activities is really not possible without effective, low-cost and high throughput screening methods. So it's important to have all these to support breeding activities. I'll take you through another paper. This was published in this year in Food Review International. So the idea of this paper is to look at the processing practices, challenges and opportunities in Africa. So in Africa, there are so many maize-based foods, but like I mentioned earlier, it's not as diversified as what you find in Mexico. So there are many maize-based foods, ugali, sadza, and a lot of other foods. And in this paper, we'll mention about 200 different types of maize-based foods. In this paper, we also developed a flow chart, and this flow chart captures about 200 foods that were mentioned in the paper. So you can trace any of the food using this flow chart. Some food are just basically the hulling, milling, and flour. And flour, you make your porridge, or you can make your dough, which you use for snacks. Some foods require soaking, sprouting, and then you can make fermentation, and then you can prepare your beverage. But one thing you won't find in this slide is alkaline cooking, because it's not a practice in Africa at the moment. But in this paper, we mentioned some entry points for this technique or method of cooking. And if you look at processing method in Africa, it's not so different from what you find in Mexico. For instance, in some methods, they use pre-cooking. Some methods, for instance, in the Kalenjin community in Kenya, they use the hash, which is alkaline for cooking. So the difference is not too much, which means it is feasible to introduce a Mexican technique of cooking to increase maize food diversity in Africa. So why nixtamalization? Of course, there are so many benefits of nixtamalization which can benefit Africa in terms of improving bioavailability of niacin and also increase calcium consumption. Also is a good source of dietary fiber and also reduce phytic acid. And also in terms of reduction of mycotoxin, it's also very, very important because mycotoxin is a major issue in Africa. It affects grains a lot, and even in milk you can find mycotoxin coming from grain. So it's a big issue, and nixtamalization can help in a way of extracting the toxin or degrading the toxin. So we came up with opportunities in African maize value chain. There are so many opportunities, but like I mentioned, nixtamalization is an opportunity that can be introduced to Africa. In terms of breakfast and ready-to-eat food, the urbanization is growing so fast, so people need fast food. And some of these can be made by pre-cooked, toasted, or extrusion technology. You also have composite flour. So some composite flour can contain cheap hydrocolloids or legumes, which can be used for baking. Also, some can be used as complementary food. You can also have dry fermented and malted cereal, which can be used for food production. So most fermented food stay in the wet form. So if you have them in dry form, you can increase shelf life. And because in some communities, they prefer fermented taste, you can even use dry fermented flour as an ingredient to introduce fermented flavors. Also for specialty food, they can be produced from nutrient-dense varieties. You also have optimized starter culture. Currently, in Africa, we use spontaneous fermentation, but it's important to have an optimized starter culture, which can be used for fermentation. So starter culture can be selected in a way that they can even improve the nutrients. For instance, some organisms are able to excrete amino acid like lysine and tryptophan. So these organisms can be selected for fermentation. Also, you have some organisms can actually produce a phytase enzyme. This is an enzyme that can break phytic acid. So you can select organisms for different purposes. Also, probiotic is very important. Most food in Africa, after fermentation, then you cook. So you lose the probiotic ability of the food. It's important to also have some food in which probably you cook, then you ferment, or you don't need to cook it. Then you can have probiotic ability. Because a lot of maize-based food in Africa have been shown to have probiotic ability. Also, it's important to standardize fermentation. And lastly, on this, the whole kernel is also an important opportunity. And also wet milling and animal feed is increasing at a very rapid rate. And this is just to mention what has been done on nixtamalization in Africa. So nixtamalization agenda is pushed very well in Africa now. So you have the Mexican embassy and CEMIT, Maize Quality Natalia, they are doing a lot to introduce nixtamalization to Africa. So recommendation from this paper is there are many high potential maize-based food in Africa that needs to be scaled up to share with the world, scale up across the continent and even beyond the continent. Also to introduce nixtamalization, participatory introduction is very important. Also promotion of techniques that can reduce nutrient loss is also very important. And also technologies that can increase the baking properties of maize is also very important. So next, I'm going to briefly tell you about my research on maize bread. So why am I interested in maize bread? This is about food security. In Europe, if you talk about gluten-free bread or maize bread, The main focus is celiac disease, which is very noble focus. But in my primary interest is about food security. Food security because maize production is in large quantity, compared to wheat. So if we can use maize for baking or for bread making, it will be very important for socio-economic development of the continent. So that's my primary interest. Secondary interest could be celiac disease. And if you look at bread consumption in Africa, because urbanization is increasing at a very rapid rate, so consumption of bread is very high. In some cases, because it depends on wheat importation, there's high fluctuation in the price of bread. And also in some cases, you don't even have it. Example is the case in Zimbabwe. You don't even have the bread. So maize being a crop that is produced in large quantity could be an alternative to wheat, could be an alternative. But one thing you see in maize is a huge technological challenge. Why? Because all the components, they are just in space. You don't really have what you find in wheat. You don't really have continuous protein network to hold the components together. So all the components are just floating in space. And that's why when you bake bread from maize, what you have is a very short shelf life. You also have a low volume, hard texture. So usually you need an enhancer, like maybe an hydrocolloid, to support and also to glue all these components together. So there are high-tech solutions. And one of it is to add functional ingredients. So you can add xanthan gum and all kinds of gum, which has been shown to improve the dough properties of gluten-free bread and even maize. Hydrostatic pressure has also been used. Also, you have novel methods, such as the use of enzymes. In some cases, they use, in one of the research, they use protease. So protease have ability to depolymerize giant proteins. And when you break this protein, you have smaller peptides, and this peptide can glue the components of maize or gluten-free dough together to have high volume or improved viscoelastic property. But I must say that these are costly methods or technology, and they are not readily available. So we need local and cost-effective solutions. Especially, this is important when targeting low or poor income communities. So one solution is pre-gelatinization. In Lesotho, South Africa, and some other countries, they gelatinize maize and then they can bake from it. So this method has a way of improving the viscoelastic property of the dough. Also, nixtamalization can improve the elastic property of dough. Sprouting. In the previous slide, you can add protease lipase, but sprouting can also have proteolytic activity or lipolytic activities because it leads to production of this enzyme, and this can be used for baking. Also, you can have composite flour with combination with legumes. Soya beans and other legumes have shown to have improved dough property for bread making. You can also combine maize with wheat, also Sado technology, and also it's possible to screen for varieties of maize that have bread making performance, or have improved bread making performance. So it's possible to screen for this. So here at CMIT, my focus is on screening for varieties that have improved baking performance. And in Wageningen, my focus is Sado technology. So briefly, I'm going to take you through my research in Wageningen. So Sado technology, that's what I'm doing in Wageningen. And the idea is some microorganisms that are found in cereal foods have ability to produce exopolysaccharide. And this exopolysaccharide can improve the dough property. So it's possible to select some of these organisms with this unique ability and then use them as starter culture for fermentation. So these can improve dough property using Sado technology. So and in some of the research, they've used EPS producers to ferment maize, and from, as you can see in the picture, ferment dough with EPS producer have higher volume. And also when it comes to gas retention, porosity, and hardness, they have improved properties. So what I did is I collected maize-based foods from Nigeria. This is ogi from Nigeria. And from this food, I isolated different microorganisms, more than 100 microorganisms, and tested them for exopolysaccharide production. So I found that 10% of this organism are able to produce EPS. And the physical way of knowing is that you see a slimy colony. And with that, you can tell if they are able to produce EPS or not. The one on the other side is not able to produce. So you can select this one for, because they produce EPS, you can select them for Sado fermentation. So after confirming they can produce, it's important to also identify them. So identification was done using catalase, gram-positive, and also microscopy, and also API technique. So after identification, I found this organism with celiac confuser. And literally, when I saw this organism, I was really confused. Why? Because in my mind, I was expecting Lactobacillus plantarum, Lactobacillus brevis. These are fancy microorganisms. That's what I was expecting. But I found it. And I checked literature. These organisms are also very known for exopolysaccharide production. So it has been used for production of bread. But this organism is not grass, which means it's not generally recognized as safe, and it's not quality presumption of safety. So I can use this for theoretical research, and maybe in Africa. Yeah. So I can use this for theoretical research, and maybe in Europe it's not grass or QPS, but probably in Africa it could be accepted for fermentation. But I also contacted one research institute, and they offer me some microorganisms. So as soon as I get back to Wageningen, I'm going to proceed with fermentation using this organism with celiac confuser, and also some other organisms that I got from a research institute. Sorry. Okay, yeah. So, yeah, I can feel the voice is louder now. Yeah. So this is where I stopped so far at Wageningen University. And then as soon as I get back, I will continue fermentation of maize to see if there's improved dough property using this microorganism that can produce exopolysaccharide. Now to go to my research on at CIMMYT here. My research is basically to look into landrace maize varieties that are commonly used in Mexico, and also some hybrid to see if they have bread-making performance, improved bread-making performance ability. So these varieties have contrasting quality parameters, and then the idea is to test if there's any of the varieties that have improved ability. And also we derived the composite flour, combination of these varieties, and also maize, wheat. So the research approach is simple. 2 land races, Hihala and Cacao Sinte. and also 2 hybrids. So we have the native flour and also the nixtamalized flour. Also, we have a high zinc wheat, which was used as composite. So what we did, different parameters we tested. Well, we tested the physical parameters and also the dough, flour and dough parameters. Like the starch, we look into the amylose, amylopectin percentage, resistant starch, and also we did solvent absorption, color, and the dough properties using mixolabs. And also we tested for minerals, iron, and zinc in this variety. Also we bake bread to, and we check the loaf volume, crumb texture. So all this data has been collected at CIMMYT. But at this point, I've been here for just 1 month, so I've not been able to analyze this data in detail. But we still think we can do more analysis, like phenolic acid, because after nixtamalization or some processing, we experience some color change. So this might be due to phenolic acid. So we can also in future test for the amount of phenolic acid that is present in these varieties. Also dissection and also nixtamalized waste stream, we can check the composition. So we have all this data, and in the next couple of weeks, I'm going to be analyzing this data. But I can show you briefly, these are the varieties of maize used. We have the landrace and the hybrid. Physically, you can see they have distinct differences. The landrace are very big and very starchy. And then you have the hybrid maize. In terms of physical properties, they have distinct properties. The landrace are very soft, and then you have the hybrid that are very, very hard. And then when you compare them to the standard for maize nixtamalized flour, it has a flotation index of around 20%. Also for tortilla industry, the maize is usually flotation index of around 40%. So the varieties we pick, they are outside this range of tortilla or maize flour. So we hope it will be in the range probably for bread making. So in terms of proximate analysis, the starch and protein are different. The starch is significantly different in terms of the hybrid and landrace. They are significantly different. The protein is more of the hybrid 2 that is significantly different. So data analysis is in progress, so I don't have much on this to show you. But in terms of baking, we try different options for baking. This is 25% of the maize. I don't have the picture of the 100% maize here, but this is 25%, and we could see differences, especially when we nixtamalize the maize flour. The volume and the texture was totally different. For some of the varieties, there's significant difference in terms of the texture when you use them as composite flour. So this is where I stop at CIMMYT, and I will continue with analysis of data as I progress. But I want to briefly show you one aspect of my research, which is analysis of volatile organic compounds in maize flour and porridge using a PTR, TOF, and GCMS. So this PTR TOF is highly sophisticated equipment for measuring volatile organic compounds. Yeah. So the idea is simple. There are fantastic solutions to address various challenges in terms of nutrition in Africa. So you have provitamin A maize, you have the quality protein, you have the mineral maize, but these varieties, they've not really attained their full potential in terms of consumption. For some of the varieties, there are some reason for some of the varieties. So you have some myths surrounding yellow maize, like American pea on it. You also have some reasons why some don't consume yellow maize, because food aid, they are associated to food aid, poverty and coal, so they don't consume it. Also, this food aid came with a lot of mycotoxins, so some of them have this perception surrounding yellow maize. Also, cultural valuation. Some prefer their foods to be very white, so this valuation is there. And also, some of them see this yellow maize in animal feed shops, so they are associated with animal foods. Familiarity, policy, and accessibility is also a big problem. But I must say, in terms of provitamin A maize, there's an improvement in terms of consumption. And this is largely because of nutritional education or awareness that is pushed very hard in Africa. But these are a lot of reasons why people prefer some varieties over the other. But in my research, I'm interested in the aroma profile. Could there be any differences in the aroma profile? Could the preference for local or white variety be linked to the aroma profile? So that's my interest in this research. So I used PTR TOF, proton transfer reaction, time of flight. So this is a very fast technology, and it's able to ionize water to H3O+, and this binds to volatile, and this can be detected even in real time. So what I found is for 22 varieties that I used in this research, using their volatile composition, I can actually classify them into their groups. So using their volatile composition, I can cluster the white maize, I can cluster the provitamin A, and even the QPM, using their volatile composition. So this shows that this instrument can tell the difference between this group of maize varieties. Also, if you make porridge from them, you can see a cluster. The yellow maize, the white maize, the QPM, they can form a cluster. So the instrument can tell the difference between these varieties using their volatile organic composition. Also, there's diversity in terms of distribution of the volatile composition. So you have, when you make porridge from the PVA, you have a high amount of harine and furan, and then from white maize, you have high amount of ester. But this measurement from instrument is not conclusive. A sensory test is important. And to do this, we had three options. One is to use blindfold. The other is to add colorant to food. And why is this? Because Africans have a bias towards the color of maize. So it's important to blank this bias. So we had three options. Is either to blindfold, or use food colorant, or change the color of the room. So in this sensory test, what we did was to use a red color room so that they are not able to see the color differences in these varieties. So we did a sensory test using this colored room. And what we found briefly is that while instrument can tell the difference, the participants couldn't actually tell the difference. So to them, there was no significant difference in terms of the taste of the maize varieties. So we couldn't find an association between human judgment of these varieties and instruments. So instrument can cluster them, tell the differences, but humans are not able to detect. However, I have to mention that we use participants in Africans in the diaspora. So probably they've acquired some foreign taste, and they are not able to tell the difference. So this is not conclusive. And also participants will use around 20, which is not sufficient to come up with conclusion on this. But one thing I can say about this aspect of research is maize has huge deposits of volatile compounds or diversity, which can be harnessed to improve the taste or the aroma of the varieties. So I'm going to conclude with these points. To feed and nourish the present and future is a complex task. And that's why it's important to have a system thinking, have a collective view of everybody. You have the breeders, you have the food scientists, consumer scientists. It's important to synthesize the view of everybody. And that's the only way we can feed the current and future population. Also, some maize-based food in Africa have huge potential to be scaled up across the continent and also to share with the world. So it's important to scale up this maize product. Also, the Mexican embassy and CIMIT is currently pushing on nixtamalization to Africa. This needs continuous effort, and this continuous effort can be successful through participation of the local people. Also, it's important to investigate also further the variability in the volatile compounds present in maize. And this can help to improve the taste and also improve the aroma profile. Also, it's important to explore local and cost-effective solutions to improve the baking properties of maize. So I would like to thank my supervisors, Natalia Palacio and Gideon from CIMIT, and also from Wageningen University, Stefano, Anita, and Vincenzo Fogliano. And also I have to mention my colleague, Hongre Choi. She has been of amazing support. So thank you very much. I also want to thank the quality lab, maize quality lab. So many of them have been of huge support to me. And in wheat quality lab, Dr. Carlos, thank you for the opportunity to use the lab. And also Anayeli and others, they have been of huge support to my work. So thank you very much for your kind attention. I really appreciate your time. Thank you.
Thank you, Onu.
No.
Just two quick questions. One, I mean, in your first two papers, you highlight a lot of opportunities. You're very optimistic.
Yeah.
Yet, if we look at the reality, not much has happened. So what do you really see as the biggest constraint for not seeing those opportunities being realized? And secondly, there's a lot of pushback internationally against over-processed foods. And kind of many of the options you're actually looking at are quite intensively processed. So any thoughts on that in terms of looking at in the future? I mean, food security is maybe a primary concern in Africa, but still with all pushback against over-processed and the intent to move more to whole grain, how do you think that fits into your options?
Yeah, actually one of the options that I'm very fascinated about is green maize. And that's why I mentioned in my presentation that for green maize, compared to other products which you overprocess and lose some of the nutrients, for green maize, you consume it as a whole, which can improve the nutritional value or make greater impact. And also for nixtamalization, which is an option or an opportunity, it's also very interesting because it's a processing method that improves the nutritional value. So it's a very interesting option. And some of the opportunities are also in fermented foods. And fermented foods are known for ages to be very healthy and safe and good. So these are good opportunities. Fermentation, green maize, they're very good opportunities. And some of these, they are pushed back because sometimes the political or policy affect the dissemination of some of these foods. I'm not sure if I've answered your questions.
Well, you answered.
Yeah. Yeah.
Thanks.
Yeah. Any other question, please?
I have one regarding the microorganisms that are being isolated from the fermented food.
Yeah.
It is actually known from the African research other microorganisms apart of the one that you have identified, or it is not, I mean, you don't know which microorganisms are actually being used in Africa?
Actually, a lot of research has been done on fermented foods. So even in one of the group in Wageningen, they've done a lot of research on fermented food in Africa. And using genetic technology now, you can even understand the entire evolution of microorganisms in maize-based food. So there's clear understanding on evolution from the start of fermentation to the end of fermentation. So the knowledge about the organism involved in all these aspects is there. So, and the one I found with celiac is also found in maize-based food, is common in maize-based food in Africa. So what we don't have now is optimized starter culture, which you can add and start your fermentation. Usually what they do is spontaneous fermentation. Yeah. It's also nice if there's a comment or contribution. It doesn't have to be a question. Yeah.
Yeah, maybe just to complement the answer to Olaf. He's actually, yes, using refined flour in the case of bread, but he's also using whole grain flour and just looking at the differences. We all know that it has to be a transition. It cannot be from one day to another we move to totally different food product. But he's looking at the different options, of course, I mean, trying to identify the better in terms of consumer preference and also in terms of nutritional benefits.